Brian, let me come to you and the response from Congressman Ruben Gallego getting a lot of attention this morning.
Yeah, it's a response overnight to the president's most recent comment about the FBI. Here is the congressman's tweet. He said, "You are such a psychopath to President Trump that you have to make even the death of 17 children about you. America will regret the day you were ever born." Look, I think what he's doing here is he's going down to Trump's level with name calling. And I think a lot of people who see this tweet react to it by saying, do you have to stoop that low? There's been two ways to react to President Trump if you're a Democrat. One is to reject his tactics, to try to go above it. The other is to embrace and copy Trump's tactics by being a name caller, by being on Twitter, responding in that way. That's clearly what the congressman is doing. What he's responding to, I think, is the most newsworthy tweet of the weekend, which is the president suggesting there's a link between the FBI missing the tip about Florida and the Russia investigation.
Hello and welcome, friends. Dr. John is here. So what is happening right now? What you're about to hear will fundamentally reshape everything you thought you understood about the inner workings of Donald Trump's administration and the people who have served closest to him. This is not speculation from cable news pundits who have never set foot inside the West Wing. This is not armchair analysis from political opponents trying to manufacture a narrative during an election cycle.
This is a nonsensical claim that the president put forth overnight, and that's what the congressman was responding to. The idea that for some reason, because the FBI is one aspect of the FBI is looking into the Russian attack on our election, that somehow they missed the tip about Florida. Let me just remind you, the FBI has 35,000 employees. So it is a nonsensical argument from the president, and it caused that Democrat to respond in such a harsh manner that, look, he's going to get a lot of rewards, a lot of praise for it from some liberals, from some of his voters, but I think a lot of criticism as well for being so personal, using the word psychopath.
Staying on the topic of tweets, I mean, it wasn't just that tweet. It was also a retweet of the Facebook executive who essentially contradicted what was in the Mueller indictment. We have that tweet there. So let's pull that up on the screen, and you can see here, this is, again, Facebook executive essentially saying that this whole operation was not about influencing votes. It was more so about causing divisions. The president retweeted that. I guess to you, Brian, I mean, you've been keeping tabs on all of this.
This is something far more devastating, far more credible, and far more damaging to Trump than any attack his political enemies have ever managed to construct. The assessments that are now pouring into the public record come directly from the individuals who occupied the most intimate positions of trust in Trump's professional orbit. These people saw him when the cameras were off. They watched him make decisions when no one else was in the room.
Is it even clear whether companies like Facebook, have they done all that they need to do, seeing as how we're inching closer and closer to the midterm elections, to prevent this sort of thing from happening again? Do they have a good handle on this?
Well, Facebook says it screwed up and it learned valuable lessons from the 2016 election, and they're putting those lessons into place now for the midterms. For example, Facebook says it's getting a lot better about recognizing when someone creates a fake profile. So if a Russian bot or anybody in any country tries to make a fake profile in order to send out messages, Facebook says it's getting better about tamping down on those a lot faster. That said, there are a lot of critics who say the company is not doing nearly enough. And this response over the weekend from Facebook's VP of ads saying, hey, what the Russians were doing fundamentally was about sowing discord. That's not necessarily a new thought. We've known that for a while. However, it is also very clear, and the executive also acknowledged, that the Russians before Election Day wanted President Trump to get elected. They wanted him to win. That was very clear. And the fact that this campaign, this operation to sow discord and chaos continued after Election Day, that actually just underscores how serious and how dangerous this campaign has been. How brazen it was that these Russian bots, these Russian trolls, thought they could get away with it and keep going after Election Day and keep sowing and causing division in the United States. I think the through line for all the president's tweets,
they witnessed the patterns of behavior that the carefully managed public image was designed to conceal. And they are now stepping forward with warnings that carry the weight of direct personal experience rather than partisan calculation. The ghostwriter who literally crafted the book that transformed Donald Trump from a New York real estate developer into a national icon of business business success has been telling anyone who will listen that the man is a psychopath, not as a metaphor, not as colorful political language.
It's Fox News. It's the right-wing narrative that's trying to ensure him that he's right and the others are wrong, whether it's attacking the Democrats, whether it's saying the Russians really were out to do something else. What we're seeing here is the president parroting talking points from pro-Trump media.
Julian, I want to talk more about this gun control legislation tweet and the president's context of when a party has control of the three levers of power. And of course, that's the case now with the Republicans holding both chambers in Congress and the White House. The first and potentially only piece of legislation the president signed that relates to gun control was one that overturned an Obama-era law that would have made it more difficult for people with mental disabilities to be able to get a gun. It would have made the legislation through the rule, actually, from the Obama administration.
As a direct assessment based on hundreds of hours spent in Trump's presence during the period when his public persona was being manufactured for mass consumption. The executive producer, who guided 60 Minutes through nearly 4 decades of investigative journalism, just walked away from his position, declaring that he could no longer maintain the editorial independence that the program had enjoyed throughout its entire history.
Would have added roughly 75,000 Americans who are deemed mentally incapable of handling their financial benefits through Social Security to the National Background Check database. Every Republican in the Senate voted for it to nullify the Obama rule, and so did these 4 Democrats. I want to put them up on the screen. Joe Donnelly of Indiana, Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, John Tester of Montana, and then you have Senator Angus King, who's an independent who caucuses with the Democrats. The 4 Democrats there are all up in 2018. They are all representing states that Trump won in 2016. What does that mean for them with this now passion that we're seeing to get stronger gun control laws? And you've got these 4 Democrats who voted for that legislation.
Well, it's unclear if activists who are now going to be demanding some kind of gun control legislation to move us out of this nightmare that we keep reliving will have the pressure and the gravitas to overcome.
And a former Obama campaign manager went on national television years ago and used clinical language to describe what he saw in Trump before most Americans had even begun to process what a Trump presidency would actually mean for the country. Let's start with the Tony Schwartz story, because understanding what happened between him and Trump,
the influence that the NRA and NRA supporters will have in the electorate of those members. And that's the battle we keep fighting and we keep watching play out. But it is possible for grassroots activists to overturn the power of the status quo. But let's remember, we have lived through this many times, and there is outrage and there is horror and many tears are shed, but the legislation doesn't change. The legislation doesn't change.
Can I suggest that it's like showing up to a garbage dump, promising to clean up the dump with only a broom or a mop? You know, it's a nice effort, it's a nice thing to try, but we're not going to get anywhere with these tiny conversations about tiny changes. And that's why I think the students in Florida are so important. Look what's going to happen later today. These students are going to launch their new organization, Never Again. They're going to speak out on State of the Union and other programs. Because they're not burdened by these debates that we've been having for decades. They're not burdened by all this old thinking. I wonder what new ideas these students might have.
Is essential to grasping the full weight of what insiders have been trying to tell the public. Schwartz was the ghostwriter assigned to transform Trump's rambling self-promotion into a coherent narrative that would sell millions of copies. The art of the deal became a phenomenon. It established Trump in the American imagination as the ultimate deal maker, the brilliant businessman who could negotiate anything, the titan whose name on a building guaranteed success. The book essentially created the myth that carried Trump through decades of celebrity and eventually into the White House. Without Schwartz, that myth never exists in the form that captured the public's attention. But Schwartz didn't interview Trump a few times and then retreat to a home office to polish up some notes. The process required him to embed himself in Trump's actual life. He sat in on meetings where Trump negotiated with business partners. He observed Trump interacting with employees and contractors and family members. He watched the performance from inches away rather than from the distance of a television screen or a campaign rally. Schwartz saw things that the public never sees, moments that never make it into the carefully curated image of success and power. What he witnessed during that extended period of access led him to conclusions that he has been broadcasting publicly for years now across every platform that will give him a microphone. He went on MSNBC and said directly that anything goes for Trump in terms of behavior and ethical considerations. He used the word psychopath repeatedly, explaining that his assessment was based on specific behaviors he observed rather than abstract psychological theorizing. He warned that Trump might refuse to leave office if he ever lost an election. That warning was issued before the 2020 election, before the Capitol attack, before all the events that would eventually prove Schwartz disturbingly accurate in his predictions. He has essentially become one of the most persistent and informed critics of Trump's character, armed with the kind of first-hand knowledge that no amount of opposition research could ever replicate. Think about what it costs a ghostwriter to publicly condemn the subject of their most famous work. Ghostwriters operate in a world built on discretion. Their entire career depends on the trust of powerful people who need their stories told without fear that the writer will later weaponize what they learned during the collaboration. Breaking that professional covenant is not something done lightly or for cheap political points. Schwartz made a deliberate choice to sacrifice the professional norm that had governed his entire career because he believed the public needed to understand what he had witnessed. That decision carries weight precisely because it was so costly to make. And Schwartz is not alone in his assessment. The pattern of insiders reaching similar conclusions about Trump's character spans decades and crosses every professional boundary that normally separates people in American public life. David Plouffe served as the campaign manager who helped Barack Obama win the presidency in 2008, a position that gave him extensive experience evaluating political candidates and understanding what qualities make someone fit for the highest office in the land. He went on Meet the Press during the 2016 campaign and said something that was shocking at the time and has only become more resonant as subsequent events have unfolded. Basically, we have a psychopath running for president, he told the audience of one of the most prestigious Sunday morning political programs in the country. Plouffe didn't stop at the headline. He elaborated, describing what he called the clinical definition of psychopathy. He listed grandiosity as a defining characteristic. He pointed to pathological lying that went far beyond ordinary political spin. He emphasized the complete absence of empathy for other people. He acknowledged immediately that he was not a psychiatrist and could not offer an actual clinical diagnosis through a television interview. But his willingness to use that specific clinical framing to apply the language of serious psychological assessment to a major party presidential candidate on a flagship political program represented a departure from political norms that signaled something genuinely alarming was happening in American politics. What makes the Plouffe assessment particularly compelling is its timing. He made these statements during the 2016 campaign, before Trump had actually held the office and demonstrated what his approach to presidential power would look like in practice. Plouffe was working from the same public information available to everyone else, but his professional experience allowed him to recognize patterns that casual observers might miss. Everything that has happened since, the refusal to accept election results, the willingness to pressure state officials to find votes, the attacks on judges and prosecutors and witnesses, the entire catalog of behaviors that have marked Trump's political career, has essentially confirmed rather than contradicted what Plouffe identified years before the full picture became visible. The broader universe of Trump insiders who have broken with him tells a story that is genuinely unprecedented in American political history. Former chiefs of staff have publicly described him as dangerous and unfit for office after leaving their positions. These are not disgruntled junior aides who felt overlooked for promotions. These are the people who managed the day-to-day operations of the White House, who controlled access to the president, who witnessed the decision-making process from closer range than almost anyone else in the government. John Kelly served as Trump's chief of staff and later became one of the most forceful voices warning about Trump's character and judgment. Kelly had previously served as Secretary of Homeland Security and had a distinguished career as a Marine Corps general before entering civilian government. His willingness to publicly condemn the president he served represents exactly the kind of insider break that tells you something fundamental has gone wrong. Former defense secretaries have joined the chorus. James Mattis, who served as Trump's first Secretary of Defense, broke with him in ways that included public statements questioning his judgment and his approach to the presidency. Mattis was not a political operator looking for a media platform. He was a career military officer who had dedicated his life to serving the country regardless of which party held the White House. When someone with Mattis's background and temperament decides that the president he served is too dangerous to remain silent about, the rest of us should pay attention. Former national security advisors have been even more direct about their concerns. These are the people who briefed Trump on the most sensitive intelligence matters, who watched him process information that affected the safety of the country, who saw how he made decisions when the stakes involved matters of war and peace. Their warnings carry the weight of direct observation during moments of genuine consequence. Even former loyalists who built their careers on supporting Trump have eventually broken with him in patterns that reveal something about how his style of leadership affects the people who work for him most directly. Vice presidents, cabinet secretaries, senior White House staff, all of them eventually reaching similar conclusions about the man they served. The convergence of these assessments from so many different professional backgrounds, so many different ideological starting points, so many different personal incentives, suggests something more than partisan opposition or personal grievance. It suggests a reality about Trump's character that becomes visible to everyone who spends enough time in his presence. The mental health professional community has added its considerable weight to these insider assessments. Various groups of psychiatrists and psychologists have published open letters over the years describing Trump as exhibiting symptoms consistent with malignant narcissism. They have characterized him as grossly unfit for leadership positions. These professionals typically operate under significant constraints when commenting on public figures they have not personally evaluated. The Goldwater Rule restricts psychiatric commentary on individuals who have not been directly examined. But the level of concern within the professional community has been so intense that many practitioners have felt compelled to speak out despite these traditional restrictions. They often avoid specific clinical diagnoses, but their broader assessments paint a consistent picture of someone whose psychological makeup is fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of democratic leadership. Now let's examine the 60 Minutes situation because it represents one of the most consequential recent developments in understanding how Trump affects American institutions. Bill Owens served as executive producer of 60 Minutes for nearly 4 decades. 4 decades of guiding one of the most respected news programs in television history. 4 decades of making editorial decisions that affected what millions of Americans learned about their government and their society. His tenure spanned Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, wars and economic crises, moments of national triumph, and periods of profound division. Throughout all of it, 60 Minutes maintained its reputation for independent journalism that asked hard questions of powerful people regardless of party. Owens resigned in 2025, and the statement he offered about his departure cut to the heart of what has changed in American media during the Trump era. He said he had lost the independence to run the show as he had always run it throughout his previous decades of leadership. That framing is devastating in its implications. He did not say he was retiring after a long and successful career. He did not say he was pursuing other opportunities. He said the editorial independence that had defined 60 Minutes throughout its entire existence had been compromised, and he could no longer do the job he had been doing for 37 years. The context surrounding his resignation makes the situation even more alarming. Coverage of Owens's departure framed his exit as coming amid legal and political pressure from Trump's second administration. The pressure included a $10 billion lawsuit Trump filed against CBS, accusing the network of deceptively editing an interview with Vice President Kamala Harris during her 2024 campaign. $10 billion is not a negotiating position. It is not a symbolic gesture designed to generate headlines. It is an existential threat to the continued operations of a major American media company. Regardless of the legal merits of the underlying editing claims, a damages figure of that magnitude applied against a news organization for editorial decisions represents a form of pressure that is designed to produce a chilling effect across the entire industry. Trump's history with 60 Minutes extends back many years and has been marked by repeated conflict. His interviews with correspondent Leslie Stahl became legendary for their hostile tone and for Trump's willingness to abruptly terminate conversations that did not proceed as he wished. His attacks on the program and its journalists have been a consistent feature of his public rhetoric across multiple campaigns and both of his presidential terms. The Harris interview lawsuit represents merely the latest and most dramatic escalation in a conflict that has been building for a very long time. Each escalation has placed additional pressure on CBS and its journalism, despite 60 Minutes having been one of the most successful and respected American news programs for generations. When you combine Owens's resignation with the broader context of pressure on the program, a disturbing picture emerges. The executive producer who led the show through decades of tough reporting on powerful figures from both parties concluded that he could no longer maintain the program's traditional editorial independence during the Trump era. The mechanism of interference may have been direct pressure on editorial decisions, or it may have been the indirect effect of knowing that a $10 billion lawsuit hung over every choice about what stories to pursue and how to present them. Either way, the outcome is the same. One of the most important news programs in American history has been compromised by pressure from the sitting president, and the institutional damage extends far beyond just the specific journalists and executives directly involved. Other news organizations are watching what happens to 60 Minutes. They are calculating their own vulnerabilities to similar pressure campaigns. Every editor who knows their company could face an existential legal threat for pursuing aggressive coverage of the administration makes decisions about what stories to assign and how to frame them. This is how press freedom erodes in a democracy, not through a single dramatic crackdown that would trigger obvious alarm, but through the steady accumulation of pressure that gradually constrains the range of journalism that appears in the public square. The Owens resignation is a warning sign that this erosion is already well advanced. The defenders of Trump's approach will offer several arguments that deserve honest consideration. They will note that terms like psychopath get thrown around loosely in political discourse, and that critics who use such language are engaged in name-calling rather than serious assessment. They will argue that former insiders who criticize Trump often have personal incentives for doing so, including book deals, media contracts, and speaking fees that reward dramatic statements. They will contend that the 60 Minutes situation involves legitimate legal claims about specific editorial decisions rather than some broader attack on press freedom. They will point out that mental health professionals who comment on public figures they have not personally evaluated are violating the ethical standards of their own profession. These arguments have some validity when applied to individual cases. Political rhetoric does often involve exaggerated language. Former staffers do sometimes write tell-all books that benefit from sensationalism. Lawsuits over specific editorial practices can have genuine legal merit separate from their political implications. Professional standards for psychiatric diagnosis exist for good reasons. The problem is not that any of these counter-arguments lack merit in isolation. The problem is that they fail to account for the cumulative weight of multiple credible sources from different professional backgrounds converging on similar conclusions across many years of independent assessment. Tony Schwartz had unique access to Trump during a crucial formative period. His assessment is based on direct observation, not political calculation. David Plouffe had professional experience evaluating political candidates that gave context to his evaluation. John Kelly and James Mattis had distinguished military careers and served in the highest positions of civilian government. Bill Owens ran a flagship news program for nearly 4 decades before concluding he could no longer do so independently. These are not random commentators speculating about public figures they have never met. These are professionals with relevant expertise and direct experience whose assessments deserve more serious consideration than dismissal through blanket claims of partisan bias. The warnings from these insiders have often proven predictive in ways that strengthen their credibility. Tony Schwartz warned years ago that Trump might refuse to leave office if he lost an election. That warning was issued before the 2020 election, before the efforts to overturn the results, before the pressure on state officials, before all the events that would eventually demonstrate exactly the behavior Schwartz had predicted. David Plouffe identified grandiosity, pathological lying, and lack of empathy as defining characteristics of Trump's psychology during the 2016 campaign. Every subsequent year of Trump's political career has provided additional evidence of exactly those characteristics in operation. The people who knew Trump most intimately have been telling us who he is for a very long time. The question is whether enough Americans are willing to take that insider knowledge seriously. The institutional damage reflected in the Owens resignation represents a different but related dimension of the same problem. When a sitting president can bring sufficient pressure to bear on a major news organization that its longtime executive producer concludes he can no longer maintain editorial independence, the entire system of democratic accountability is compromised. Investigative journalism serves a function in democracy that no other institution can replicate. Courts can enforce laws and Congress can conduct oversight, but journalism is what brings hidden misconduct into public view in the first place. When the independence of journalism is compromised, the entire accountability ecosystem is weakened. Other journalists see what happened at 60 Minutes and adjust their own behavior accordingly. Sources become more reluctant to share sensitive information. Editors become more cautious about approving stories that might provoke retaliation. The chilling effect spreads silently through the industry, and the public never knows what stories they are not seeing. The scenarios for how this situation evolves going forward range from concerning to genuinely alarming. One possibility is that continued pressure campaigns succeed in compelling more American journalism institutions to adopt patterns of self-censorship similar to what we have witnessed at 60 Minutes. This outcome would represent significant long-term damage to press freedom and democratic accountability that would take generations to repair. Another possibility is that legal and political resistance eventually succeeds in limiting the most aggressive pressure campaigns through court rulings, legislative action, or public backlash. A third scenario involves future administrations deliberately restoring traditional relationships between government and journalism through policy changes and rhetorical commitments to press freedom. The fourth and most damaging scenario is that current patterns continue indefinitely with accumulating damage to American democratic culture through sustained pressure on independent institutions. Each of these possible futures has different implications for how American political culture evolves over the coming decades. The outcome depends on choices being made right now by voters, by journalists, by judges, and by political leaders about how seriously to take the warnings that credible insiders have been issuing. Democracy does not defend itself automatically. It requires people who are willing to recognize threats and respond to them before the damage becomes irreparable. The ghostwriter who created the myth of Donald Trump has been trying to shatter that myth for years, armed with the knowledge of what he actually witnessed during the creation process. The executive producer who sustained one of America's most important news programs through nearly 4 decades of political turbulence has concluded that the same independence can no longer be maintained under current conditions. The campaign manager who helped elect a president has applied clinical language to describe what he recognized in Trump before most Americans had begun to grasp the implications. The chiefs of staff and defense secretaries and national security advisors who served closest to the presidency have emerged from their service with urgent warnings about the character of the man they served. The mental health professionals who study personality disorders have broken their own professional norms to express the depth of their concern about what they observe from a distance. All of these voices are telling the same story. They are coming from different backgrounds, different professional experiences, different political orientations, but their conclusions converge on a shared assessment that Donald Trump is fundamentally unfit for the office he holds and dangerous to the democratic system he swore to protect. The question that now confronts the American public is whether these warnings will be taken seriously or whether they will be dismissed through the same partisan filters that have allowed the crisis to deepen, despite years of increasingly urgent alarm from the people who know the situation best.